programs at the African Climate Foundation. The African Climate Foundation is a philanthropic organization based in South Africa, but with presence across the African continent. We support climate action through grant making, and we have country programs in Nigeria, Senegal, and South Africa. The topic for today is unlocking Africa's green growth. And as we know, there's been a lot of ongoing discussion about green growth and green industrialization in Africa. The question is, how can Africa industrialize in a way that does not compromise the global climate agenda? And from an ACF perspective, we see it in two ways. On one hand, there's a question of how can Africa add value to the green minerals that are abundant on the continent. And then on the other hand is how can we improve manufacturing, grow our industrial base in a clean manner. So the agenda for today is very simple. We would have a keynote address from His Excellency Adnan Amin, after which we would get a presentation from Justin Barrett from the International Energy Agency. After those two presentations, we will go into a panel discussion where we talk about some of the positive signs for green growth and some of the barriers that we are seeing today. So without further ado, I'll hand to His Excellency Amin.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Very good to be with you here today. I believe there are few of us, but it reflects quality more than quantity, and I'm very pleased that you made the time to be here, because what we're going to talk about today are things that are very important for the future of Africa. We often come to climate negotiations and we are thinking about focusing on all the negative impacts of climate on Africa. And there are many. The adaptation agenda today is critical for Africa. Response to climate change is critical for Africa. But at the same time, emerging global policy presents huge opportunities for Africa's industrial and economic future. And I think this is where we need to really start paying attention and focusing about how the future should look, because this is a moment of tremendous opportunity for the continent. Today, 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. Energy transition is happening in Africa at a fast pace. Africa provides some of the most intense resources that are central to the global transition, as well as central to food security for the world in the future. So Africa is a resource-rich continent, but it is also rich in human resources. We have the youngest population in Africa. And one of the most inspiring things when you travel around the continent is to see all the young people who are educated. We call them the Gen Z, people who are going to change the world. Some of our political leaders are a little bit uncertain about that, but Gen Z in Africa is doing extraordinary things. I look at the startup ecosystem in many countries. If you look at Ethiopia, Kenya, in East Africa alone, the vibrancy of the startup space is really impressive. These are tech-literate young people, educated young people who want to invest in the future of their countries, who have ideas for the future. So these are the resources. We have the human resources, and we have the natural resources to look at the future in a very different way. Talking about energy, the debate has always been here about, well, we need to do climate mitigation. And we agree, climate mitigation is going to be a critical issue for our common global future. But at the same time, we need to remember that Africa contributes only 4% of global emissions. This is 52 countries contributing 4% of global emissions. Africa has a right to develop. Africa has a right to energy. and energy essential for the future development of Africa. But what is also critical is that we're seeing Africa's move towards next generation technologies, clean generation being really amazing to look at. I grew up in Kenya. Kenya is more than 90% renewable energy electricity in its electricity mix, based on hydro, solar, wind, and geothermal, one of the leaders in geothermal. Ethiopia is moving in the right direction. Today, more than 28 countries in Africa are importing in 1 year more than 100 megawatts of solar. That in itself is not a big issue. What is a big issue is that a few years ago this was nothing, and this is the beginning of a wave of clean energy installations that are going to give energy security to African countries and are going to give energy affordability and are going to provide the energy resources for the development of Africa's future. If you look around the continent, we have 6 economies which are installing more than 2 to 3 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity in their systems. South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Nigeria. These countries are moving fast. These countries have had problems with energy access in the past, but the new mode of investment is truly becoming something both inspirational, but a potential game changer for Africa's future, but also a contribution to the global struggle against climate change and its impacts. We need now to address what is the reality of how this energy is going to be deployed, what green industrialization in Africa looks like, how do we turn African economies into high value addition economies, not resource extraction economies that have internal innovation processes, that have investment processes that can result in outcomes that are relevant in the global economy, and we have the resources and the capacity to do that today. We need to start focusing on 2 things. One is Africa's responsibility to create an environment that can handle private capital, that can attract inflows of financing, and that has a regulatory and policy framework that gives confidence to investors. Much of that is already there. There's a false perception out there that somehow risk profiles for African investment are higher than elsewhere, but this is contradicted by the record, because you see in the record that investment in Africa is actually yielding reliable long-term yields and returns on investment. We have to get that story out, but we also have to get the story that the destination, the African destination for investment, is one where investors can enjoy security of their investment and high returns. This also has to have a social component. This development has to be meaningful not only for an elite, it has to be meaningful for the broader population of African countries. The net beneficiaries should be the people of these African countries, and we need social policies in place to do that. Employment is going to be a big part of that, and what we can already see with the transition to a green economy, that high-paying, high-skilled jobs are more and more available. It is much more of a high return for labor in new technology than it is for resource extraction or merely only for agriculture. And I think we need to maximize the levers for how that happens, and the transfer of technology issues are going to be critical for how we integrate that into Africa's development strategy. But finally, we have to talk about financing. And being here, I think we need a narrative for African countries to start engage in the climate debate from the point of view of the historic responsibility of historical emitters to provide the financing for this transition to take place, not as charity, but as investment, as a win-win scenario where investors also win, but Africa receives the capital and the finance that it needs to do that. I think we are now in a watershed moment where the development in Africa has started to move apace. The depth of that development is reaching into African economies in ways that it hasn't before. And we have a very positive prospect in the future if we can get this right. And this needs also to take into account how the climate negotiation and the financing instruments coming out of climate are going to evolve to provide an input into Africa's future development. So the future, in my view, is bright. I think we have African institutions that have the capability to carry that. I'm very pleased that the African Development Bank is with us. The way they are now evolving their portfolio is in a very positive direction. They don't act like the World Bank and IMF anymore. They act like a real African institution. And we are very happy about that because I think they understand the needs of African countries more than other multilateral development institutions. I was the Director General of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, many years ago. I was founding Director General. And our focus was always on Africa, not only in terms of capacity addition by installing solar panels or a few wind turbines. It was about transformation, economic transformation was at the heart of it. And the initiatives that we put forward, the interconnection of African economies, both infrastructure, building out grids, but creating regulated markets for electricity trade at scale that would have been transformative because it would have lowered the cost of energy for African development for the future, as well as lowering emissions. So there are many things out there that we need to take forward, but my real message to you is that we are today at a position of opportunity in African development that we have not had for a very long time, and we cannot afford to miss this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adnan. I totally agree, and I'm sure we all agree in the room that this is a moment of opportunity and one that we should seize. So to provide more details on what this opportunity looks like, I would like to invite Justin Barrett from the International Energy Agency to share some data and insights with us. Thank
you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I have a slide deck. Pleased to share today the findings of a report that we developed in support of South Africa's G20 presidency and delivered to them in October. So it focuses on sustainable industrialization and the concept of stepping up the value chain for Africa in particular. Just wanting to get my slides up. Sorry, so I've got it, sorry. Okay, there we are, the slides are up now, thanks. Okay, my first message is that the clean energy economy is emerging. And so from relatively niche markets just a couple of decades ago, clean technologies such as solar, wind, and others constitute a sizable and important industrial economy. So back in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was agreed, EVs were only around 1% of new car sales, compared with around 20% today. And solar PV capacity additions were only around 10% of what we estimate they were last year. So at that time, the sales of 6 key technologies had a market value of just under US 200 billion. Now that figure is now rapidly approaching US 1 trillion, so it just shows you the level of growth in that market over the last 15 years. Now that market value is set to grow even further. So our most recent scenario work, reflecting current policy settings, so our most conservative policy scenario, sees that market value rising to more than US 2 trillion by 2035. Now, just to give a point of comparison, that's close to the value of global crude market in recent years. So it shows the significance of the shift. Now, one of the issues, however, is that supply chains are really heavily concentrated. So while some African countries, notably South Africa, DRC, and Morocco, amongst others, are already playing an important role in supply chains at the mining and extraction steps. As you move upstream, the role of African countries becomes more and more limited. So you can see here on the blue bar for copper, manganese and cobalt, so the critical minerals mining stage. Then as you move up through refining, material production and energy technology manufacturing, you see that blue bar slowly disappear entirely at the back end. So this is one of the areas of big opportunity that we see for the continent. I'd just like to make the point as well that there's obviously an energy security issue if you have such extreme concentration of supply chains, and we see an important role for Africa in that regard as well. So it's not just about the African region. The same is broadly true across other emerging economies. So there's only very few clean technology manufacturing facilities in operation in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia as a whole. So combined, these countries account for less than 5% of the value generated from clean technology manufacturing today. And you can see the direction of travel for a lot of the critical minerals. You know. I'm going to try to speak a little bit more clearly through the concentration and using this slide here. So this shows where investment is and is not taking place at the moment. Now, at the IEA, we track these investments at the individual plant level. So for solar PV and its components, we count over 700 factories, mostly located in China, India, and Southeast Asia, as well as in the US and Europe. And we see a very similar picture for wind. So nearly 500 factories operating worldwide, with some notable manufacturing capacity being located in Latin America. And finally, we count around 1,600 factories building electric vehicles and batteries. And so overall, there are now several thousand manufacturing facilities for clean technologies in almost 60 countries in operation across the globe. But there's only a handful of facilities in the whole continent of Africa, meaning that Africa is not reaping the economic and job benefits of clean tech manufacturing. So it currently accounts for less than 1% of the value generated at the manufacturing step for clean energy technologies. And that, of course, tends to have a much higher economic value than the earlier segments. Okay. So as I mentioned, we developed this report for South Africa's G20 presidency, and it's really a deep dive into how Africa can try to tap into this opportunity by stepping up the value chain. So we know, of course, that Africa is endowed with vast energy resources, so fossil fuels, but also solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and critical minerals, all extremely important for the transition. But we also know that many in Africa still lack access to basic energy services. The other point I want to make here is that African economies have very good potential for low production costs. They also have rapid domestic demand growth, and they also have proximity for other markets, to other markets for export. So I'd like to speak through three main areas of opportunity now, starting with the opportunity for critical minerals beneficiation. So instead of exporting at the extraction stage, trying to work up that value chain. So today, with the exception of platinum group minerals and copper, most minerals are exported from Africa in a raw and unprocessed form. Now, as I mentioned, the refining stage delivers much of the additional value added and provides access to most liquid end user markets. So we see that shifting gradually from a business model that's based on raw mineral exports to one that strategically and sustainably emphasizes local beneficiation could increase the market value for a representative portfolio of minerals in Africa by nearly 3/4 compared to today's level, reaching 120 billion by 2040. So you can see the jump up there, 69 to 120. So I'd also now just like to speak about opportunities in energy-intensive, low-emissions commodities. So low-emissions processes where there are new markets. So this is low-emissions iron, steel, ammonia, and so we address all those issues in the report, but I'll just speak to the issues of iron and steel today. So Africa's got a lot of potential for demand growth for crude steel, because it's relatively early on in the urbanization journey. The population is also expected to grow and urbanize rapidly in the next decade, which means a likely increase in demand for critical infrastructure for housing, and which means steel. So on the right-hand side, we have different cost options for steel from the perspective of the European Union. So now we're talking about the export market. So the potential value or the cost to a European market of importing from Africa. So this is essentially a bottom-up estimation of the cost of production in 2050 in a high potential for Africa case. So the key bars to focus on here are the top bar and then the bottom two as well. So we have those set out the cost of low-emission steel imported from Africa, that's the top bar, and the bottom two bars, which in the 2050 case, set out the cheapest option for EU steel to import low-emission steel from Africa. So that's when compared to their traditional import markets. So it just shows that the interest that moving up the chain, that there'd be very good market opportunities for African countries. Final slide. Oh, can you hear me okay? Sorry, yeah, I'm struggling with this mic. Okay, I'd just like to speak to a final slide on opportunities in energy technology manufacturing. So my colleagues produced a new model to try to look at the levelized cost of production and estimating that based on a bottom-up approach. So looking at all the key inputs for production, whether it be energy prices, labor costs, capital costs, material costs, and so on. And they found that Africa could achieve significantly cheaper rates than the EU, and could potentially could potentially even be cost competitive with China, with the necessary enabling conditions put in place. So I think the key point to remember here is, China's got the market concentration at the moment. If Africa could create conditions where it's operating at a competitive level with China, then that suggests an enormous potential in terms of market access. So just to give an idea for the EV supply chain, there are already important footholds in certain countries, and in the high potential case, we see that Africa's EV production would rise from virtually nothing today to nearly 4 million units in 2035, and then on to 5 million in 2050, so tapping into that market. Okay, I'd just like to leave a few considerations here, because I think there are a couple of recommendations in the report, both at the domestic level but also in terms of international cooperation, because it was delivered for the G20, but it obviously goes beyond those countries. So I think there's a need to strengthen domestic markets through, I think, a really concerted move forward with the energy industry and trade policies, and ensuring that those set of policies are working in tandem. Through prioritizing and ensuring countries are playing to their strength, attracting and trying to support innovation. In terms of international cooperation, there's a lot of cooperation to be done on collecting data and also tracking progress. And here the International Energy Agency has been a traditional partner, and is very keen to continue to work with our African partners in that regard. And also efforts to coordinate across supply chains, so in terms of critical mineral supply as well. That brings me to the end of my presentation, but very happy to answer any questions and join the panelists.
Thank you so much, Justin, for the amazing and insightful presentation. I think between the keynote address and your presentation, we have a clearer view of some of the opportunities for green growth, as well as the challenges that are ahead. So the panel session that we'll be moving to would try to unpack some of those barriers now that we've seen the opportunity. So I would like to invite the panelists to the stage. So thank you once again for making yourself available to join this panel discussion. As I mentioned earlier, this event is hosted by the African Climate Foundation. We work in the intersection of climate change and development, and this discussion, we hope, would inform our strategy on green industrialization in Africa. And I'm also hoping that members of the audience will find this discussion valuable as we unpack some of the challenges or barriers to the green growth opportunities that we have seen. My first question will be to Alhamdo from the African Development Bank. Given your role in the finance space, I'm sure you have a very clear view of some of those barriers, especially on the financing side. So we would like you to please take your time to unpack some of the challenges you're seeing from a financier's perspective, and hopefully that would inform strategies of different organizations working on this topic.
Hello. Okay, thank you very much for inviting the African Development Bank in this very interesting conversation. And I'm glad that the focus of the discussion is more on opportunities than challenges, because I believe green growth in Africa is not just about challenges, but also opportunities. And we know that, and as mentioned by His Excellency today, there is a range of opportunities when it comes to transitioning to green growth on the African continent. The African Development Bank has really taken stock of that when we have decided to have our first strategy on green growth. You may remember in 2012, there was the Rio Plus 20 conference here in Brazil. And the concept of green growth has been discussed, and there was an agreement that the world has to transition to a green growth trajectory. So back home, we have decided that our 10-year strategy, we has to be focusing more on this agenda. And we decided that we should mainstream green growth in our development finance strategy in the African continent. So one thing we have done is to really having a strategy is one thing, but we need to translate that strategy into actions. We have created also the right institutional framework for that. We currently have a dedicated directorate in charge of climate change and green growth. We also have developed some financing instruments that support that, but because, as you know, there is no international financing instrument solely dedicated to green growth. We have climate financing instruments, but what we are doing is to make use of those instruments in order to support the green growth, knowing that there are challenges, especially challenges about access. Access to financing is not easy. The cost of borrowing also on the African continent is high. And this is also related to another issue, which is about the perceived risk of investing in the African continent. I came across a report recently that says that, perception on Africa is costing annually $42 billion to the continent. Only perception, including stereotypes and so on. So I think there is a narrative to be improved on investing on the African continent. But when it comes to financing, and this is to directly address your question, the main challenge is really to address the cost of borrowing, the cost of accessing to finance in a very affordable way, because today, a young entrepreneur or a startup or a SME in the African continent willing to access to a bank to a bank loan has to go through a wide range of challenges. And the interest cost is quite high. We have been discussing that recently, and we compared with the interest rate in Africa and the one in the rich countries, and we saw that a young entrepreneur in a rich country could pay around 2 to 3% interest rate, while at the same time in Africa, a young entrepreneur has to pay around 15 to 30% interest rate. So I think these are challenges, real challenges that we are facing, and we used to say when discussing that in the African Development Bank, that potential is there, the opportunities is there, but nobody eats potential or opportunity. We need to translate this potential and those opportunities into actions. So, because at the end of the day, whether it is in the renewable energy sector or climate smart agriculture or infrastructure, or even, we are talking about demographic dividends. All of that needs to be translated into job creation, economic opportunities for the people, but also resilience of communities. So our experience tells us that, and I'm going to stop here, that we need to really address this issue around access to finance. We used to say we are talking about the AAA of finance in Africa. Finance has to be accessible, affordable, but also available. These three aspects have to be addressed. You're talking about climate finance for green growth in the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the really important contribution, especially your point about risk and perception. I think in the opening remarks, Adnan also highlighted that the risk, whether real or perceived, seems to be spoken about in very negative terms when it comes to African climate finance. So I wanted to turn to you to ask if you could share insights on how we can change the narrative, whether through data, through advocacy, or other means that you've seen in your previous roles.
Let me say, first of all, Hamdou captured the right three words. In fact, I was in the COP28 presidency, and those are exactly the words we used. Finance must be available, it must be accessible, and it must be affordable. But this is elusive in the African context. And I think, we really need to begin to address beyond kind of tinkering with institutional reform for multilateral financial institutions, etc. We need to address how the direction and flow of resources for productive investment for Africa can scale up. And I think that requires us to use the instruments that we have available, which are not currently used. We need a leadership in Africa that takes a Pan-African approach. We now have an African free trade area, access to a market of 1 billion people, growing economies, growing purchasing power, but we give free access to those markets. I don't know how many of you have tried to export anything from Africa to Europe, but the kind of difficulties you run into are immense. So I think we need to start developing a common area trade regime which actually creates a level playing field for African trade. It creates a market that goes to scale, and it creates incentives for investment to reach that market that begin to get resources to flow. I think we also need to invest in people. I think Hamdou mentioned, Zira, you mentioned, there is a very active innovation space in many African countries today. And honestly, whenever I go and I travel to different African countries, and you see the energy that young people have in innovation, in finding new solutions. I'm on the jury of something called the Zayed Future Sustainability Prize, where we reward innovations in health, agriculture, energy, and water. And when I look at the submissions that come from African small and medium-sized enterprises or not-for-profits, they are remarkable in the area of health, using tech solutions, water, sustainable use of water, sustainable agriculture and food security. We have immense innovation happening that we are not able to capture, reward, and scale. And we need policy frameworks in the African setting that really begin to do something like that. On the more industrial scale, you know, whenever people who are not from Africa talk about Africa, they just see critical minerals and dollar signs. And it's like, oh, Africa is a source for critical minerals. How do we get them out? How do we incorporate them into our manufacturing processes? And I think the time has come for a continental policy on how we are going to deal with critical minerals that are going to be the building blocks of the future economy globally. How do we give value to them? How do we create an industrial structure that begins to actually go beyond just mining these into processing, including into final outcomes? That's where the real value added is, and that's where the real financial return comes from. Why should we be, in this stage and age, still exporting copper, still exporting zinc, still exporting manganese, cobalt for pennies in terms of what the final product actually is? And I think that requires us to engage with investment and trade partners in a completely different way. Not to be recipients of prices, but to set prices and processes ourselves, to create a policy framework and a trade framework that begins to reward African resources rather than exporting them very cheaply. So I think it's really a changing mindset, and to capture the positive trends we already see in a way that can add value to African economies in the future.
Thank you so much, Adnan. That's very insightful, and it's a segue to the question I wanted to ask Justin from the IAA. There was you had really interesting charts, but there was one that really caught my attention, and I could see everyone trying to take photos of it. The one where you showed the value chain and where value is added, and Africa's role on the upstream side, but almost zero role on the downstream side. So I wanted to ask if you to expand on that, and if there are examples from other regions that have been able to move up the value chain, and any insights you could share on how Africa could shift down the value chain.
Okay, is that working? Yep. I'll just speak as loudly as I can into this. I'm conscious I have a quiet voice, so please, if you can't hear me, just give a shout out. Now, so one of the points I made when I was presenting this slide is that Africa is in blue, right? So you can see how the progression as you go up the value chain in terms of Africa's presence. But what I didn't say when I presented this slide is that the red is a concentration in one single company, one single country, right? So this is an issue for countries trying to come up the value chain, but it's also an energy security issue in the sense that, a lot of minerals and the actual supply chain, the manufacturing chain is really concentrated in a single economy, which is great when things, when it's helping with the efficiency of the transition and when things are working well. But when there are tensions geopolitically, that can be a source of risk. So I guess the first point I want to make is that this is a question that is not only relevant for African countries, but it's one that's relevant for countries more broadly. And so, the IEA has made a number of recommendations on how countries can start to diversify. And of course, one of the issues is that there's a reason why China is so prominent in this market at the end. It's because they're very cost competitive. And so, I think if you're looking at trying to diversify your markets, the next best market in terms of cost can be up to 50% more expensive. So, it means that governments will need to put in a lot of public capital up front, but also look at strategies to try to bring the private sector in. But I think this is also why for Africa it's such an important opportunity, because as our analysis shows that as I went through before, if Africa can be cost competitive, and our analysis suggests that it can be, there's a real opportunity for it to then tap into that market and to start to be very competitive with China, which would open up markets across the world, including because governments are interested at the moment in diversifying their supply chain, but also the whole way across the clean technology development chain, and production chain. So I hope that answers your question. I also just wanted to, I guess, make the point, listening to a lot of the discussion from the panelists, that I think Brazil's initiatives for the action agenda are actually quite important from an African point of view, because they're bringing things onto the agenda that haven't necessarily been in the COP architecture before. I'm thinking about energy access, which is obviously, and clean cooking access, which are issues of critical importance for the continent, including for enabling business development, right, reliability of electricity supply and so on. But also, the issue of critical minerals is something they've included. The Baku to Belém roadmap, looking at how to try to bring finance to a broader set of countries, and the IEA played quite a significant role in supporting on the development of the energy component of that. But I also wanted to mention, when we're speaking about the cost of capital and finance and bringing the required money and funds to Africa for climate action, we did a report for the Brazilian G20 presidency that looked at this very question, that how we can try to accelerate access to finance for developing economies and emerging markets. So I just wanted to call that work out as well.
Thank you so much, Justin, for expanding on that. I have a lot more questions to ask, but I don't want to be selfish, so I would open to the audience. If there are questions, I will take two before we close.
Well, thank you. So I am Dr. Devajit Palit. I have worked extensively in Africa in the 2010, most in 15 countries on behalf of my organization. What I have seen, so I am from Chintan Research Foundation, is a think tank based in New Delhi. So, and we are into climate change and energy transition work. We would like to work in Africa. So my question is, I have seen when I was working in the off-grid electrification sector and renewable energy sector, there are many examples, policy examples from Global South, whether it is from the Asian countries or otherwise, which can be replicated in Africa. But Africa, many of the African countries, wherever I have worked in both East and West Africa, have been looking forward to examples from Europe and not from the Global South. Though the Global South examples, policy examples, and technology examples might be more relevant for Africa. So why it is so? How do we change that thinking process?
I think that's a good question, and I think this was the case, that we were, at one point, African countries were technology takers, and access to African markets was advanced economies. So even okay. So even issues where we knew our own conditions better, we were basically told what are the technology choices. But I don't think that is the case anymore, because I think what we see in the Global South is a rise of an innovation culture and a manufacturing culture in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. That's truly remarkable. And I think where the space is now, and you participated in the off-grid renewable energy conferences we had in the past, where business models were coming from some German guy with an idea or some. Now, increasingly, the application of off-grid solutions is coming from the Global South, where people have the experience of actually creating off-grid applications, installing off-grid energy in specific conditions, and innovating around technologies that begin to provide productive use from small renewable installations, but also where microgrids and mini-grids are going to go in the future. And I think that includes not only the hardware, because we know the hardware comes from a number of countries in the South, but it also includes the intelligent systems that begin to tie it all together. And we're seeing now kind of whole of economy approaches built around clean energy or clean technology solutions that are being deployed, where this enables a host of other things to happen. How do you look at weather forecasting for agriculture? And how do you adapt to that? How do you have data for medical applications being saved in rural areas in ways we could never do? Disease prediction, and so on. And also in terms of water availability. So all of these things are beginning to come together. But at the end of the day, what we are going to need is a much more transformational approach to make power available at scale and to provide systems for the delivery of that power. So the way I see these standalone systems is that they are becoming nodes that will be part of a broader interconnected network at some point, and much of the experience and technology for that is going to come from the global south, because that's where these kind of solutions are being pioneered. So I think the days are over, and you know, coming back to the earlier question, you know, when you're dealing as a trade bloc with a country of 50 million people, it's a walkover. When you need to access a trade bloc of 1 billion consumers whose incomes are growing, that's a very different proposition, and it gives Africa a lot more cards to play in terms of how they integrate into the global economy. We're now facing a number of issues that are coming up, like CBAM, where somehow never Africa, that has only produced 4% of global emissions, their exports may be subject to taxation under CBAM into the European market. I think that if this is the way that we are going to go, and this is a discussion in the COP, that we have to think about what are the reciprocal measures that Africa needs to take. How do we protect our economic position also? So I think things have changed a lot since those days.
We'll take one more question. And
Thank you very much. Excellent information. I was struck by the data you gave, Dr. Hamdu, about a startup entrepreneur in a G20 country paying 3%, and the same person in Africa pays a minimum of 15 and then up to 30%. That's staggering. Here's my question. How do you, actually to both of you, how do you advise African leaders when they are making trade deals or policy engagement to look at the bottom line? I'm thinking of some of the policies like AGOA, Africa Trade and Opportunity Act, that really disadvantage Africa, allowing other countries to dump material in Africa, and yet Africans had several roadblocks to export materials to the US, for example. So what advice do you give African leaders to ensure that these exploitative policy, trade agreements, economic cooperation stop right away?
Thank you very much for this very pertinent question. I think we know that there are challenges, of course. And in my view, where Africa needs to do a lot of work is on issues around governance. Let me explain, because I mentioned that issue around the interest rates in Africa, which is high compared to Europe, for instance. And this is largely because of the perceived issues, perceived risks that we just discussed. And banks in Africa, for instance, also rely on the international system. Countries in Africa are being rated by the international financial, rating agencies. And all of those are related, and the way the governance challenges that African countries are facing, if they are not improved, I mean, this continues to affect the perceived risk, and in turn, this reflects on the high borrowing cost of money. So I think all of that is related, and I think that if there is an area where there is a lot to do is on governance. That's number one. Number two, I don't think why should Africa continue to export everything to Europe or to other places. The manufacturing sector in the continent is very weak. And there are areas, there are sectors, there are activities, economic activities that have to be manufactured in Africa. And we need to export products with high value instead of continuing to export raw materials as we used to do. So developing a strong manufacture, a robust manufacturing sector in any African country is very important. I think this is the way we should go. We have been advising African countries on those areas for many decades now, but yet we see some challenges. But there are countries that are making progress, of course, but we need every country to be on that pathway, developing, coming to the issue of technology. Why will we continue to always get technologies from Europe or from Asia? Why don't African countries develop homegrown technologies? We know that there are challenges around transferring technologies from other places. This is an issue being discussed here in COPs for several decades, but no progress on that because of challenges relating to intellectual property rights and so on. And I believe there is an opportunity to develop technologies on the continent, maybe learning from the global south and also from Europe or the US, but technologies have to be developed also in Africa. Those that we cannot develop, of course, we can import. But the way I'm seeing, even on the renewable energy space, solar, for instance, most of the technologies are still being imported from China and other places. But we know that there is a lot of innovation taking place in this continent that could be leveraged in order to also develop homegrown technologies. And I believe these are areas, and to do that, we need also the right enabling environment, policy environment, regulatory frameworks that could enable technologies to be developed, or technologies, green technologies could be imported. We need also incentives in place in order to allow green technologies to be imported in Africa or developed in the African continent. So addressing the governance issues is one thing. We need also a strong manufacturing sector. We need homegrown technologies. But most importantly, I believe we need to work on innovation, tapping on the innovation in the continent. For instance, I know that I'm sure Mr. Adnan knows that the mobile money technology that we are using here currently in the African continent has started in Kenya with M-Pesa. And this has expanded to become something now big that has improved financial inclusion in the African continent. There are examples like that we can bear in mind when thinking about developing technologies, using technologies, but most importantly, how we can develop technologies in the African continent that could help transition us to green growth. But I believe this is an area where there is a lot to do, and your point on advising, we have a lot of platforms for country dialogues with countries. Those issues are on the table, but yet we know that there are also political issues in the African continent that are also limiting those solutions, those advices that we provide to the countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, we'll have to go to the next segment, which is our closing remarks. I would like to thank the panelists for your really, really great, insightful contributions, and of course the audience for participating and coming. There's a theme, I think, or something foundational that emerged in the discussion, which was the question of governance, which I think Alhamdulillah mentioned even more clearly in the end. I think that's very foundational, and that's the foundation on which we can build all the other financial policy regulatory systems. So for our closing remarks, we have a representative of the Natural Resource Governance Institute to share some closing thoughts on the role of governance, after which we can call it a day. So.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Tengi Georgie Curley, Country Manager for Nigeria's NRGI. And this was a very important conversation, and I think that the panelists have done a really good job at teasing out a lot of the core issues. Over the last week, there's been a lot of excitement with the integration of critical minerals and the draft negotiated outcomes, with the recognition of the environmental and the social risks. But now there's an importance to center value addition opportunities for the African continent. And so that's why this panel session, I think, was very important. So congratulations to ACF for ensuring that we had this conversation today. I'd like to build on some of the conversations that were already started here and some of the questions that were also raised in terms of policy and potential approaches to investment on the continent. Drawing from NRGI's lessons. So this is a really great opportunity for Africa, and it's one that we must center, but we believe that NRGI, that it must be, we must adopt strategies that are evidence-based and that are targeted. We've seen that there's a lot of interest and excitement about value addition, and that has already been emphasized by the presentation by IEA. But at NRGI, our research has also shown that this is not necessarily a new area, and so it must be one that must be explored with a sense of responsibility across our different countries. It must be one that we consider what is feasible and what is actually beneficial for our different regions. Not every country will be able to move across the value chain at the same pace across every mineral. And so there needs to be a space for regional collaboration and a true sense of assessing at different country levels where their value is across the value chain, because just that there's an opportunity doesn't necessarily mean that each country can assess that value. This will allow policymakers, we believe, to focus more on how to deploy the limited capital that they have, limited technology and resources to maximize value, to ensure that there's limited costs and emphasizing more of the benefits. Countries like Nigeria have partnered with the AFC and Wood Mackenzie to assess the visibility and processing across their value chains. Zambia, Namibia, Madagascar have done a similar work ongoing with UNCTAD because this is a very essential component. Where are the optimal pathways across the value chain, and how can countries actually collaborate regionally to assess those opportunities? As an example that we reflect on Indonesia, where Indonesia put in place an export ban around its nickel. But what is not often discussed is that Indonesia actually explored this as well with copper and cobalt, but it received and saw the dividends in nickel. And so that speaks to the point that we don't just explore opportunities because we have this ambition to assess value chain, because it seems to be the reigning conversation, the reigning opportunity, but it's more about how we're more targeted to ensure that, one, we are putting in the right strategies in our countries, but also exploring regional collaboration, which brings me to the point where conversations were being had about, South-South collaboration, more engagement around the value chains. We mentioned job opportunities earlier on. And so that keys in as well to the point that was made by AFDB, that there are political considerations as well and constraints that hinder sometimes these ambitions that we have on the continent. But a lot of work has to then be done by civil society, by media, by governments, to ensure that the benefits are communicated to country citizens. Because citizens are unlikely to want their jobs potentially to be moved next door. And so we need to communicate that where the opportunities to scale up processing, manufacturing, the potential for greater jobs than if you co-located refining or opportunities in one community or one small region. So there's a lot of dynamism and opportunities that different regional opportunities have also provided. There's the AFTA that was mentioned earlier on as well, but we must learn from the other opportunities and other strategies that have been developed more regionally that have taken more of a top-bottom approach. So we must have a more bottom-top approach that is more organic and grows steadily to be able to achieve our goals and learn lessons so that we can have a more sustainable approach to collaboration and also scaling up these different opportunities that now present themselves to Africa. We must not lose this opportunity as we have potentially done others that have come before. So just to finally surmise, we must put out the message that supporting Africa's value chain ambitions is in everyone's interest. Investors, different countries that require those supply chains to accelerate their renewables, Africa as well. We must be persistent in our engagements to disrupt and stabilize those inequities across global value chains that risk fueling public frustration, supply disruptions, and reduce cooperation to address climate action if these issues that I've stated are not centered. So treating Africa solely as a provider of raw materials, which has been mentioned throughout this presentation, would not only be unjust, but it would also potentially put at risk our climate objectives. And as we go into negotiations now, having successfully integrated critical minerals and the different risks, we must use the information that we have gathered here through this panel to promote for greater value addition and great opportunities for the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you all once again. Can the speakers come to stage for a quick group photo, please?